Hello everyone, welcome back. Today I wanted to do a different kind of video from what I typically do. On this channel, I usually do deck techs and things like that, but today I kind of wanted to show some common EDH cards to avoid and just some misconceptions that I see in deck building, especially for a lot of newer players. So just the usual channel stuff, get the cards you need from the link down below, like, comment, subscribe, do all that, I appreciate it. Anyways, here's a disclaimer. All the cards that I'm going to show in this video, they're just my opinions on them. They're not all encompassing. Like, there's going to be reasons to use some of the cards in the video, even if I say not to use them. It just depends what your deck's trying to do. It depends what's good in your play group and all that. And also, just because they're on the list doesn't mean they're bad cards. Like, there are cards on this list that I still use, and I'm going to make fun of them. I just wanted to show better options and just some of the things I've seen in deck building that people... Just some of the misconceptions, like some of the things I see people do are just automatically, I build this new deck, so therefore this card has to be in it, when it's like, it doesn't really need it. And also, the deck list is not perfect. Like, some of the cards and some of the quote-unquote upgrades I say are just my personal preference, which you might not like. I try to be budget-friendly, but sometimes I can get a little bit out of control. But let's get into it. So, the first thing I want to talk about is you should be running talismans over signets. The main reasoning behind this is because talismans, even though they both cost the same mana, talismans can tap for mana right away. Even if you lose a damage from getting a color, it doesn't really matter because you still have access to the colorless right away, which even if you need the colors, you have it, and if you don't need the colors, it's still right there. Whereas, let's say turn 2, when you play a signet, like, it's just that. Like, there's no more going beyond it. There's no more dropping, like, a Soul Ring or whatever, or like a Sensei's Top, or whatever one mana thing you want to do, right? You kind of lose that option by playing the Signet over the Talisman, where if you do, I don't know, let's give a turn, for example. A turn 1 could be, a very good turn 1 could be Island, tap it, Soul Ring, tap it, Talisman of Creativity, and then we can use that Talisman to Preordain or Brainstorm or like any kind of cantrip, right? Whereas on the same turn, you just kind of have land, Soul Ring, is it Signet, you're limited, that's it. I will say that there are some ways to have the Signet over. Like, let's say in a deck like Niv Mizzet, right? Like, you want that color fixing more. However, like, it's still... in Niv Mizzet, I would run both, but this is like a good example of like where a Signet could be better and makes more sense, but I think in an over-encompassing throughout Commander, if you're going to run one over the other, pick the Talisman. 3 Visits in Nature Lore is significantly better than Farseek. Nature's Lore and 3 Visits are the same card. Search your library for a forest, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle. Farseek says, search your library for a plains, islands, swamp, or mountain card, put it onto the battlefield, tapped, and then shuffle. Looking at the actual functionality of these cards, Nature's Lore and 3 Visits do what Farseek wants to do, but better, right? So the issue with Farseek is it has to get something tapped, right? It can basically get anything because in a realistic sense, when we're using these kind of cards, we're probably not in mono green. We're definitely not in mono green if we're using Farseek. So assuming we're in a 2-color deck or a 2-color plus deck, we're probably tutoring up a Surveil land or a Shock land, or beyond that, we're maybe even getting a Triumph, right? The big difference with these cards is Farseek is always going to make that card enter tapped, whereas 3 Visits can make, let's say, that Shock land enter untapped, or let's say, for example, a Cinderglade. Farseek is going to make that Cinderglade enter tapped, whereas we could just get it with 3 Visits and it would enter untapped without any real downside to us. So kind of Farseek is just, the main point I'm trying to make is Farseek is always going to make it enter tapped no matter what, whereas 3 Visits has the potential to functionally get everything that Farseek can get and more, especially for like the duels and the triumphs, and have that thing potentially enter untapped. Stop using Commander Sphere. Guys, Commander Sphere came out basically with OG Commander, and the idea that it was really good at the time, add 1 mana of any color in your commander's color identity, and then you can sacrifice it to draw a card, and it costs 3 mana. The issue is it's basically a do-nothing 3 mana rock. Like, you don't want the effect of your 3 mana artifact to get rid of it to draw a card. Like, that's not very good. Let's talk about it. Commander Sphere, it only taps for a color in your commander's color identity, whereas most other 3 mana artifacts tap for every color. Now, I know what you're thinking. Dude, That doesn't matter because it taps for all of my commander color, it taps for all of my decks. Why would I want it to tap for any color? Well, because Commander is a wild and wacky format, and if you steal your opponent's creatures and those creatures have activated abilities and you can't activate those activated abilities, oh well. Or if you steal opponent's cards, or like things happen. Commander's a crazy format. I'm saying you don't want the upside of your 3-mana artifact to get rid of it and draw a card. So for example, like Relic of Legends, like this is like a great upgrade for it. Because Relic of Legends, it taps for 1 mana of any color, so functionally it's the same cost and it does the same thing you want Commander Sphere to do. However, it has the other ability of tapping an untapped legendary creature you control to add 1 mana of any color. So it basically gives your legendary creatures Convoke in a weird way. It's just upside that can give you more mana, aside from just destroying your own rock and drawing a card. Like, I'll be honest, I used Commander Sphere back in the day, and it's because it came in every precon, and it was fine back, like, when I started playing Commander, you know, like, over a decade ago, right? It's like, someone wipes the board, cool, sacrifice Commander Sphere and I'll draw a card. I really don't lose that much, but it's kind of like, with that kind of potential upside, you're losing so much other upside of just having established effects that don't result in you losing your own thing. Or even Vexing Puzzle Box, right? You can add a fun aspect to it because like it's still functionally you want to use Commander Sphere to tap for any color, which is what Relic of Legends and Vexing Puzzle Box do with just way more upside. Vexing Puzzle Box is whenever you roll one or more dice, put a number of charge counters on it equal to the result on Vexing Puzzle Box. Taps for a color and then roll a d20, put a number of counters on it. Then you can remove 100 charge counters from it to search your deck for an artifact and put it onto the battlefield. Like, think of the upside with this. You're now turning your 3-mana rock into a very serious threat later in the game. Looking at Relic of Legends, you're now turning your 3-mana rock into potentially tapping for more than 3 mana the turn it comes out. Whereas Commander Sphere, you pay for 3 and you kind of have 1 mana and you can sacrifice it to draw a card. Like I get 2 mana, I'll say 3 mana, tapping for a mana, so now you've only spent 2 mana, and drawing a card is not really that good. Chromatic Lantern is not always the answer. What I mean by this is I see a lot of players running it in their decks, especially the 2-color, 3-color, 5-color, whatever decks. Honestly, guys, Chromatic Lantern, it really is not that necessary in 3. I see it a lot in 3-color decks. 2-color decks definitely doesn't need it. It's kind of the same logic of like use Vexing Puzzle Box or use the Relic instead of this 3-mana rock, right? At least this is a 3-mana rock with upside. So if you're going to use Chromatic Lantern or Commander Sphere, use Chromatic Lantern. But I digress. The thing is, I see a lot of 3-color decks still using Chromatic Lantern, and the real thing is that like if you're building your mana base properly and you have an adequate amount of dual lands and you have an adequate amount of ramp and an adequate amount of just like rocks in general, you don't need Chromatic Lantern. Like, you're probably way better off just running any kind of actual mana ramp instead of running this rock. And if you need to fix colors, if your deck needs to fix colors so badly, again, there is cards that don't fit this. Say, for example, the Niv Mizzet that I mentioned earlier. Yeah, Chromatic Lantern is good in Niv Mizzet because that kind of deck requires you having only colors. Like, that needs a lot of colors. But if you're just in, like, I don't know, a Bant deck or a 3-color, like, deck, you don't really need this so long as you have the adequate dual lands, the adequate ramp, the adequate card draw. It's kind of like Chromatic Lantern is like a crutch if you can't do all that. But I'm saying most decks have options and opportunities to do that. You really only want to put Chromatic Lantern in your 4-color plus decks. MDFCs are a double-edged sword, and this is what I mean by this. I see a lot of people, especially when Zendikar Rising first came out, and some people have not shaken out of this, is that people believe that MDFCs can adequately replace lands, and kinda they can, but also they kinda can't. Balaged Recovery is a really good example and a very common one, because people will cut a forest for Balaged Recovery, and sometimes that's fine, because it's 3 mana, return target card from your graveyard to your hand. Great, that's a great ability, and it's a land on the other side when you don't need it. The issue is when you have a couple of these in your deck, that's okay, you know, maybe 2 or 3, you can say, oh yeah, like I can go down like a land or 2 to replace it. However, I see a lot of people that have like a lot of MDFCs in the deck with the idea is, well, it's a creature when I need it and a land when I don't. It's like, well, it's a tap land or it's going to like deal 3 damage to you. So it's kind of like you're either having a lot of your lands enter tapped for the potential like upside. Like Battle Guide Recovery is a really good card, but a lot of the other MDFCs are kind of just mediocre. Not all of them, but a good amount of the uncommon ones and the ones where people try to fill their mana base with MDFCs are slow. And that's the issue. So you can have a couple of them, but really don't start cutting lands for them. Better may not always be better. Let's talk about this. Generous Gift and Stroke of Midnight, instant, same mana cost. Generous Gift says destroy target permanent. Its controller creates a 3/3 green elephant creature token. Stroke of Midnight is destroy target non-land permanent, and its controller creates a 1/1 human creature token. The big difference between this is Generous Gift hits a permanent and they make a 3/3. Stroke of Midnight hits a non-land permanent and they make a 1/1. You have to start to think, what is the better option, right? Generous Gift can hit everything, right? I guess it can hit lands is really the only thing it misses on Stroke of Midnight. So you have the opportunity to deal with a pesky Field of the Dead or a pesky Glacial Chasm or whatever, as well as anyone else's artifacts, enchantments, whatever, planeswalkers, battles, even if you feel like it. But Stroke of Midnight still kind of does that, and they make a 1/1. Like Stroke of Midnight, what I'm trying to say is Stroke of Midnight doesn't hit a land, but how often are you trying to hit lands in Commander? Not very often. You're most likely, at least when I use Generous Gift or Beast Within or any of those effects, I'm getting rid of like an artifact or enchantment or something that I'm already having a hard time dealing with. Whereas Stroke, and like they get a 3/3. Whereas Stroke of Midnight, it's still functionally doing the same thing and they get a 1/1. But dealing with a 3/3 and dealing with a 1/1 can be really, really tricky. So you kind of, it's not really this is bad and this is good. It's more like think of what makes sense in your playgroup. Do you have a lot of problematic lands in your playgroup? Maybe Generous Gift is the answer. Do you not have a lot of problematic lands in your playgroup, or does Generous Gift often do more bad in your deck? Say, for an example, a mono white weenie deck where you have a lot of 1/1 tokens and stuff. Dealing with a 1/1 is way easier than dealing with a 3/3. Just a thought. Cards in theory versus cards in reality is something that is hard to evaluate and really only happens once you run it, right? Herald's Horn is one of those really good cards in theory, but in reality, it's actually very bad. Let's talk about it. When it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Creatures spells of the chosen type cost 1 less. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top card of your library. If it is a creature card of the chosen type, you may reveal it and put it into your hand. Let's think about the realisticness of it, in theory. This card is really, really good. It makes all of your tribal deck creatures cost 1 less, so it's functionally a rock. And at the beginning of your turn, you look at the top card of your deck, and if it's one of those creatures, many tribal creatures in your deck, you get a free draw. That's fantastic. Here's the card in reality. It comes down turn 3, and it's not really doing anything. Functionally, you'd probably rather have a mana rock on turn 3 rather than this. It also depends on, like, there's not a lot of tribal cards that work super well with this, right? Let's say, for example, like an elf deck. Like, an elf deck doesn't care about its creatures costing 1 less because it already generates so much mana, it just doesn't matter, right? And, like, looking at the top card of the chosen type, that's really only, when you think of it, it's really only roughly a 1 in 3, right? When you think of your average commander deck, you're going to have like 30-something lands, you're going to have like 30-something creatures, and you're going to have 30-something non-creature, non-lands, right? So functionally, you only have a 1 in 3, and this is from turn 4 and onward. So when most games are ending at turn 8 or so, you're really only like maybe at best drawing 4 cards, even in that. So it's basically looking at the odds, you have like, you're drawing 1 card off this on average in a game. And the spells cost 1 less. It doesn't matter in an elf deck. Even if you have a big mana deck, let's say, for example, I used to run this card in my elemental tribal deck, right? The issue with elemental tribal deck is you'd rather just have the mana, because when you have an elemental deck, it kind of goes to big mana, and this is only a cost reducer, so it doesn't net you any mana, it just reduces the mana, where in most scenarios, you'd rather just have the 1 extra mana rather than the reducer, because in an elemental tribal deck, you have a lot of rocks and you have a lot of ramp, so this card only is affecting a third of your deck, and a lot of the times it's really not that relevant. Like, it's almost better to not have it and have like another like card draw spell or another ramp spell or even just another mana rock. So again, not really an upgrade, not really a misconception. It's more or less just a food for thought to think about, is like, think about a card in theory, how great Herald's Horn is, and then in reality, it's kind of a cost reducer that maybe draws you a card, but maybe draws you a card once a game, once or twice a game. It's all right. Mana dorks do not replace ramp. I see this very often, especially in some of the competitive scenes, or rather when competitive players make non-competitive decks. Mana dorks don't replace rocks and ramp. The issue is, let's say I see people keep one land hands and like have a Llanowar Elf because they're like, cool, turn one forest, tap it, Llanowar Elf, I'm good to go. I got 2 mana right now. And then that Llanowar Elf will die, and then, or like they won't draw another land, and functionally they get stuck. Like, I've seen games where people have kept like 1 or 2 land hands and a handful of mana dorks, and once those mana dorks are gone, they're functionally out of the game. And I'm not saying cards like Kodama's Reach and Felwar Stone are like the end all be all, but I'm saying they have better guarantees, right? Felwar Stone, I mean, unless Llanowar Elves, like, unless you're like in like a tribal deck, that's kind of different. But like Felwar Stone comes down, taps for, it's basically Arcane Signet. Functionally in Commander, it's Arcane Signet. And Kodama's Reach is going to search your deck for 2 basics, 1 to the field and 1 to the hand. So you're not missing a land drop next turn, and you've ramped. So turn 5, ideally if you're playing it on turn 3, on turn 5, you'll have, or sorry, turn 4, you'll have 5 mana, which is still pretty good. Just know the fragility of these kinds of cards is what I'm trying to say. Like, you don't want to be like, oh yeah, I'm just going to cut a land to put like a Birds of Paradise and cut another land so I can add an Elvish Mystic or Gilded Goose or whatever, because they don't replace it and they're fragile. When someone wipes the board, you'll find that you lose all of your stuff. EDH cards may be bad in casual EDH. This is another thing in some arguments I've seen in the past. Say, for example, Minor Misstep. Minor Misstep and Simian Spirit Guide are absolute all-stars in competitive Commander, right? Where you have so many, Minor Misstep, for example, we have so many 1-mana tutors, we have so many free counter spells, we have so many free spells in general, right? And it's really, really good to just be able to counter them with 1 mana. And you can make the argument for Commander. It's like, well, you have a lot of the 1-mana Vampiric Tutor, Enlightened Tutor, Mystic Tutor, any of those tutors. You have a lot of free counter spells. Not free counter spells, but like, you know what I mean, like free like rocks, Soul Ring, Sensei's Top, all of that kind of stuff, right? Enough people run it where this is like, could be viable. Or even cantrips like Brainstorm or Serum Visions or Preordain or whatever, right? That doesn't really, it's not really that big of a deal in Commander, right? Because in CEDH, that's like a really big deal, but ultimately it's like, oh, well, you traded 1 of your mana with 1 of my mana, right? I guess I'm not tutoring or like whatever at the best, but more often than not, like, most people's decks curve out. Like, this card's going to be stuck in your hand for a long time. Simian Spirit Guide's like another great example too. Or in competitive Commander, it's like you're getting your, like, he's an extra red mana whenever you feel like it. That's really, really good. That 1 extra red mana can pay for a Mana Tithe. That 1 extra red mana can get your commander out 1 turn earlier. Sounds really good. But in Commander, that's not really relevant. It's just like a 3-mana 2/2 sometimes, and it's just a really bad ritual that you're just holding on to forever. So, again, really, really good in competitive, but very lackluster in casual. And then I want to talk about Commander fragility and a cautionary tale. I see a lot of people build decks around the Commander, and sometimes that's true, and sometimes that's really bad. I'm victim to it. It is what it is. Commander fragility is what I mean when I say, if you build around your commander should be there to enhance the deck. You shouldn't fully focus on your commander. Earl the Miststalker is a great example, and here's my cautionary tale. The whole deck, Earl the Miststalker, is based around casting Earl and then putting as many auras as you can to kill people with commander damage. Say, for example, you put a card on Earl that says Earl gets double strike. Okay, cool. Well, now Earl is a hexproof double striking 7/7 commander. Like, that's very close to killing someone with commander damage. The issue is when you build a deck based solely on a commander, people know it, and people will take advantage of it. if Earl gets countered, you're now waiting until turn 7 to cast him again. If Earl comes into field and then he dies to a board wipe, you're now waiting to turn 7 and you lose all of the auras attached to it. These are the kind of things where it's like when you fully focus on one thing, it's like, and it gets disrupted, which it will because it's commander. Like, because you're kind of going with the ideas, well, if I cast Earl, right, who's going to counter it? Like, most likely everyone's going to want to counter it because they'll see that it's turn 5 for you and they'll hold up mana because that's what you're going to want to do. This is for any kind of Voltron commander. It's like, well, they're going to wait until you have the opportunity to cast it, and then they're going to counter it because once it's on the field, it's going to be impossible to deal with. Just like how Earl has hexproof, you can give him pro colors, you can do any of the instant combat tricks to give it hexproof or indestructible or whatever. Pro colors, phase out, whatever, right? If you go all in, people will take advantage of it and they will kill it on sight. That's my cautionary tale, is I've had an Earl deck. People would wait till turn 5. I cast them, cool, they counter it. My deck does not function until later. Like, it's so focused on this one card that it's the main way to win. Just be cautious of it. Don't build around your commander. Your commander should just highlight what the deck is trying to do. That's all I got for you guys. Get the cards you need from the link down below. Like, comment what you think of the video. Comment some of the stupid things I said and correct them with your own opinions. As always, subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.